Hello! Welcome back to Heavenly Official's Blessing, Chapter 24. I'm gonna change up YouTube settings, get things ready, and wait on folks to arrive, and then we will continue reading. Hey, Jeff, welcome. Let's here. There we go. How's everybody doing today? Hopefully doing pretty good. I'm alright. It is incredibly hot where I am right now, but I have the fan on, so please God, let it help. Let's see, put this in the right playlist. Oh yeah, thumbnail, that's important fix. We want that. Alright, so if you weren't here last time, or if you don't know what we're reading, Heavenly Official's Blessing is a Chinese web novel. It is set in a fantasy setting in ancient China where there's magic and demons and gods and monsters. Very high fantasy style. It is also a romance between a fallen deity and his only believer left in the world. It is two men. It's very episodic, kind of monster of the week kind of thing. And this time we are solving a mystery of this former kingdom that fell during a war, and nobody's really sure, exactly what happened in that history 200 years ago. But ever since then, the land of the desert surrounding that kingdom has been cursed, and people keep disappearing, monsters keep poisoning people, bad things happen. So our hero, Shi Lian, the god of bad luck, goes to figure out what's happening. He's followed by Hua Chang, who is masquerading as a human boy, but everybody knows he's not. Everybody knows he's actually a ghost. He goes by San Lang in his human form. His ghost name is Hua Chang. And then there are two demigods who are basically Shi Lian's servants. They don't trust Hua Chang, they don't like him, but Shi Lian likes him. That's why he keeps him around. It's like, hey, I think you're pretty cool. Also, let's bang. So that's where we are. They are in the desert kingdom trying to figure out what's going on. Last time they found a corpse buried in a garden where they were trying to get some plants that would cure the poison that everybody keeps getting poisoned with because of all these desert creatures. And the face was like, hey guys, you should come close so I can see you better. Come close to me. And the face claimed that one of their number, which includes some humans who came from a caravan, was there when he got caught 50 years ago. So this corpse in the field says, someone in my group is among your group now. Maybe it's the monster that got me. Oh, anyway. So, this is chapter 24. Scroll down. Let's move this up a little bit. Chapter 24, Obscure Hua Lian, Fall... Oh, that's cute. Okay. The whole title is Obscure Hua Lian, Fall into the Sinner's Pit at Night. You'll notice Hua Lian is one part each from Hua Chang and Shi Lian's names, and apparently it's a play on word. It's not just a ship name, it also means flower and pity, probably referring to something poetic like Obscure Flower Pities the Night. So the author turned their ship name, which is actually, yeah, it is Hua Lian. It turned their ship name into a poetic term. That's cute. The more he acted like this, the more Shi Lian thought it was dangerous. He said, everyone retreat, don't approach it, and don't pay attention to what it says. Everyone rushed to follow his words and hurriedly dispersed. The face buried in the mud gave a forced chuckle as he said, don't leave. Why are you being like this? I'm also human. I won't harm any of you. Shilian thought to himself, you're overthinking it. In this condition, you do not resemble a human at all. Who would have thought that right at this moment, a sudden change would occur? A merchant probably thought that no matter what, they still had to bring back some medicinal herbs to save people. Thus, that merchant took a few furtive steps forward before he stooped down to pick up the herbs he'd thrown away in fright. The eyeballs of the face buried in the mud rolled around before they fixated on the merchant. Following that, a bright light flashed through the eyes of the half-buried face. Shilian mentally thought, what bad luck, as he rushed over and yelled, "Don't pick them up! Come back!" However, it was already too late. The face buried in the mud suddenly opened its mouth before a strip of scarlet slipped out. It was an extremely long tongue. Shilian grabbed the back of the merchant's collar before he repeatedly withdrew. Unfortunately, the thing that flew out of the half-buried face's mouth was incomparably long. Accompanied by a squelch, it slipped into the merchant's ear. Shilian felt the body he was holding undergo a fit of violent trembling. The merchant released a short, blood-curdling scream as his four limbs spasmed incessantly before his knees hit the ground. Swiftly, the long tongue scooped out a huge, bloody lump from inside the merchant's ear before it withdrew back into the mouth of the half-buried face. The half-buried face laughed while chewing. He chewed until his entire mouth was practically dripping with blood, while he laughed until his deafening voice nearly overturned the roof of the dilapidated imperial palace. In a screech, the face said, "Delicious, delicious, delicious, delicious! I've been starving to death! I've been starving to death!" This voice already sounded sharp and shrill, while both the face's eyes were completely bloodshot. He truly looked disgusting. This person had been buried here for over 50 years. They'd long been assimilated by the demonic kingdom and thoroughly become something completely inhuman. Shilian let go of the merchant's collar, which he'd been holding with his right hand. He was about to chop the disgusting thing in half when suddenly he heard the half-buried face screech again, "General! General! They're here! They're here!" Following that, everyone heard a howl that was even more ferocious than a wild beast's. A black shadow dropped down from the sky before landing heavily in front of Shilian. Hey, Lobsel, thanks for joining us. The moment this black shadow fell onto the ground, it almost appeared as if the ground had trembled from his landing, and by the time he'd slowly stood up, everyone became shrouded with the immense shadow cast by his figure. This person was truly too tall. His complexion was as dark as iron, while his facial features seemed vicious and aggressive. In fact, his face appeared similar to that of a beast's. Armor covered his stomach and was draped across his shoulders. He was over 9 chi tall. Rather than say he was human, it was better to describe him as a gigantic wolf that could walk upright. And behind him, he was followed by 1, 2, 3, more than 10 people jumped down from the roof of the Imperial Palace. Hey, Phil. Each and every one of these people were tall and strong. The build of their bodies were similar, and atop their shoulders, all of them carried cudgels that were densely covered in sharp wolf teeth. It created an illusion that a pack of wolves had transformed into people. After they landed on the ground, they completely surrounded everyone in the garden and made them feel as if they were encircled by immense iron towers. Banyu soldiers. Waves of black spiritual energy emanated off of these soldiers. Without a doubt, they had long been deceased. Shilian's entire body was stretched taut. If things took a turn for the worst, Roy would immediately be ready to move. However, when these Banyu soldiers saw them, they didn't immediately pounce on them and attack. Instead, they let out howling laughter that shook the heavens. Then they began using a tribal language to loudly converse with each other. They seem like friendly folks, don't they? I'm sure they mean well. The language sounded quite strange. The pronunciation seemed tricky, and there was a lot of tongue rolling involved. It was the language of the Banyu Kingdom. Although 200 years had passed and Shilian had already forgotten most of the Banyu vocabulary, It could be considered he had just reviewed it with Sun Long in the general's burial mound. In addition, with how these soldiers' voices were as loud as a large bell, and how their enunciation was crude with their vocabulary simple, it wasn't hard for Shilian to understand them. He heard all the Banyu soldiers call their first soldier General. As they conversed with each other, Shilian also heard words like drag them away and don't kill them for now. He breathed in deeply before he softly said, "Everyone, don't panic. For now, these soldiers won't kill anyone. It seems like they want to bring us to another place. By all means, don't act blindly without thinking. I can't guarantee I would be able to beat them, so let's act according to the circumstances." Shilian only needed a single look at these soldiers to know they'd be hard to deal with. Each of them were coarse-skinned and thick-fleshed. Even if he had Ruoi on hand, Shilian was afraid that strangling a single one of them would take a decent amount of time. Since a dozen had arrived simultaneously, they wouldn't be easy to handle. In addition, several ordinary people were also present at the scene. Without a better option, the best thing to do would be quietly wait for changes. Sun Long didn't say anything, and everyone else didn't really have an opinion. Even if they wanted to act blindly without thinking, they didn't know how to act blindly without thinking. They could only tearfully nod their heads. Only the half-buried face was still screaming, "General! General, let me go! I helped you detain the enemies here, so let me go back home! I want to go home!" Ever since he saw this group of soldiers, the face became extremely excited. He kept shrieking while sobbing, and there were some clumsily pronounced Banyu vocabulary mixed in with his shouts. The face ought to have casually learned then, during the 50 or 60 years he stayed there as fertilizer. When the 9-chi tall man, who was called General, saw how there was something in the soil that kept twisting and screaming, he also thought the face was disgusting. The general hammered down his cudgel embedded with wolf teeth, and the numerous sharp, pointy teeth pierced the half-buried face's head. The face screamed once. Since the sharp teeth were already lodged in the front of the head, when the general lifted his cudgel, he ended up completely uprooting the half-buried face. Ironically, the general took the face out of the dirt, realizing the face's let-me-go wish. However, what was connected to the face and neck after it broke through the ground wasn't a person's body at all. It was a thickly boned skeleton. A few of the merchants who saw this frightening scene were scared into yelling. The face that had been half buried in the mud dropped off the teethed cudgel and was completely covered in blood. When the face saw its own body, it seemed it had been frightened. He gasped and asked, "What is this? What is this?" Shilian reminded him, "This is your body." It was easy to comprehend after thinking about it. The person had been buried in the desert for 50 to 60 years. The flesh of his body had long been transformed into nutrients for the herbs. He had been entirely consumed until the only thing remaining was a mere skeleton. The face that had been buried was unwilling to accept the truth. He asked, "How could this be possible? My body isn't like this. This isn't my body." His voice sounded incomparably mournful. The scene looked frightful, yet lamentable, causing Shilian to shake his head. However, Sun Long sneered before saying, "You can't bear to see your own body right now? If that's the case, what was the thing that came out of your mouth? You think there was nothing wrong with that?" The face that had been buried in the mud immediately retorted, What's wrong with it? It's only a bit longer than an ordinary person's tongue, that's all." But both the corners of Sun Long's eyes and the tips of his eyebrows expressed his derision. He said, "Not bad. Only a little bit longer." The face that had been buried in the mud said, "That's right, it's only a little bit longer, and it's only like this because for the past several years, to survive by eating flying and crawling insects, it got longer and longer. That's why it became like this." When the face had first been buried in the soil, perhaps he'd been alive. In order to keep on living, he would desperately stick out his tongue to eat all sorts of insects. Gradually, the face stopped being human, and the tongue grew longer and longer, and the food he ate changed from flying and crawling bugs to things that were even more frightful. However, because he had always been buried in the soil, the face hadn't been able to see the state of his body for all these years. He was simply incapable of accepting, nor was he willing to believe he was no longer human. The face that had been buried in the mud strived to explain, "There are people whose tongues are relatively long." San Lang smiled. When Shilian saw this, he felt an indescribable chill. The smiling face of this youth gave people a grim feeling, as if he was on the verge of peeling off someone's face. San Lang asked, "Do you believe you're still human?" After he asked this question, it seemed as if the face that had been buried in the mud felt a sense of danger. He became jittery and said, "Of course I'm human. I'm human!" As the face yelled this, he expended much more effort in an attempt to move the hands and feet that had already turned into white bone. It seemed like he wanted to crawl on the ground. Perhaps it was because he had finally emerged from the dirt, but the face felt genuine happiness. Howling with laughter, he said, "I can go back! I can go back now!" His laughter had become too ear-piercing, so it finally irritated the Banyu general. In a single stomp, the skull of the face that had been buried in the mud instantly shattered. His shrill cries of "I'm human" would never occur again. After that general crushed the annoying face, he shouted something at the soldiers in a loud voice. In response, the crowd of soldiers brandished their cudgels embedded with wolf teeth and roared a few times at the group of people. The soldiers began herding the people towards the exit of the imperial palace. Shilian was at the very front, and as always, San Lang followed right behind him. Even though they were forcibly escorted by a group of fiendish soldiers, the youth's footsteps were as measured as always, as if he was just taking a stroll. Ever since earlier, Shilian had been trying to find an opportunity to talk to him. After walking for a while, he noticed how the Banyu soldiers began once again chatting with one another. Since they didn't seem to be paying much attention to them, Shilian quietly said, "They call the leader Banyu soldier General. I wonder what kind?" Sure enough, San Lang still answered him the moment Shilian asked a question. He said, "When Banyu Kingdom was destroyed, there was only one general. His name, translated into classical Chinese, is Keimo." Shilian replied, "Keimo?" The name was indeed quite strange. San Lang said, "That's right. Reportedly, his body had been delicate and frail when he was young, so he was frequently bullied. As a result, he vowed to become strong. He developed his strength by grinding down a rock and earned a name like this." Let's see, there's a little footnote here. Okay, so K means carving, engraving, or cutting. Mo means grinding or polishing, so he was named for that because he got his strength by grinding rocks. San Lang spoke up again. The legends proclaim Keimo as Banyu Kingdom's bravest and fiercest general in all of history. With a height of 9 chi and extraordinary strength, he had been the Banyu Grand Tutor's faithful supporter. Shilian asked, "And is he still a supporter after his death? Is he bringing us to the Banyu Grand Tutor right now?" San Lang replied, "Perhaps." If there were even more soldiers there, how would they escape? In addition, how was Nanfang doing after he'd drawn away the other two? They had also gotten a hold of the Kindred Mooner, but how are they supposed to deliver it into the hands of the poisoned within 24 hours? Shilian contemplated these questions as he walked. He also noticed that General Keimo was leading them somewhere increasingly remote. In the end, he brought them to a place that was at the very edge of Banyu Kingdom, and only then did General Keimo come to a halt. Shilian stopped walking and raised his head to look up. An incomparably tall and yellow wall stood in front of him, bearing a resemblance to that of a giant person. Their destination was unexpectedly the Sinner's Pit. Although he had once lived near Banyu Kingdom for a period of time, Shilian hadn't actually entered Banyu City that much. Of course, he'd also never approached the Sinner's Pit, but now that he was seeing the pit from up close, his heart had inexplicably sped up. There was a staircase on the outside of the yellow wall. While they slowly climbed up the simple and crude stairs, Shilian glanced down. As he constantly surveyed his surroundings with his eyes, he finally understood why his heart had sped up. He wasn't trembling with fear because he associated this place with one that used torture. It also wasn't because he was worried the soldiers would push him into the pit. Instead, his heart palpitations were because of a response to him sensing the presence of a spiritual array. Someone had deliberately set up an extremely powerful spiritual array using the terrain and layout of the Sinner's Pit, and this array had only one purpose: to make the people who fell into the pit eternally unable to climb back up again. What the so-called unable to climb back up again meant was, even if someone threw down a rope or a ladder, the person at the bottom grabbing hold to climb up, when they got halfway to the top, the array would activate and punt them down again. Without batting an eyelid, Shilian placed a hand onto the wall. He brushed his hand across a small section of the wall and roughly made out what it was composed of. Shilian discovered that though the wall seemed to be made out of earth or clay from afar, it was actually created from incomparably hard stone. In addition, there was probably some kind of spiritual incantation used to fortify the wall, making it inevitably hard to break through. When they got to the top of the staircase, they arrived at the roof of the sinner's pit. What was located above the ledge of the yellow wall was a sight to behold at first glance. One could only use the word shocking to describe the scene. The entire pit was precisely created by the enclosure of 4 tall walls. Each of those walls were more than 30 zong long and 20 zong tall. Let's see, that's 10 Chinese feet. It's 3.3. Wow, that's thick! Every wall was 4 chi thick. Towering above all, they looked extremely awe-inspiring. What the 4 walls were encircling was a huge 4-sided room. However, there weren't any platforms to stand on across the top of the sinner's pit, or even a horizontal beam. It was already evening, and one completely couldn't see the bottom of the immense dark pit. From time to time, only waves of cold air and the smell of blood wafted up from the bottomless darkness. Everyone was walking on the ledge of a tall wall, and it didn't have any protective fences whatsoever. Since they were walking at a high altitude, where the ground was at least 10 zong away, not many people dared to look down. Phil. Yes, that is obviously what the translation for, however many zang it was. That just translates to thick. After walking for a while, the people at the front came across a tall, erected pole. A corpse was hung from the pole, and it was the dead body they'd previously seen from the ground. The corpse appeared quite small, and was the body of a black-clothed young girl. Her clothes were worn out and in tatters, while her head hung low. Shilian knew the pole was specifically used to hang the sinners soldiers wanted to humiliate. Usually jailers would tear away the sinners' clothing before hanging them naked. They would let the convicts starve to death or dehydrate. After the sinner died, their corpse would sway with the wind, be exposed to sun and rain, and would ultimately air dry. While their limbs and body rotted, their flesh would fall down. The appearance of the dead body would be extremely unsightly. Since the corpse of this young girl still hadn't rotted, not much time could have passed since her death. Perhaps she'd been a resident who lived in the vicinity, but these soldiers hung a little girl's body in a place like this. They were truly savage and cruel. When Zhao, Tiansheng, and the others saw this scene, their complexions all paled. They came to an immediate halt and didn't dare go forward. Fortunately, Mo had also stopped walking. He turned around and faced the sinner's pit before he made a long and loud yell. Shilian thought it was strange. Why does he need to yell like this? The next moment, he received the answer to his question. Appearing to be the response to Mo's loud shout, a snarl came from the bottom of the pit. It sounded like the roar of a tiger, a wolf, a monster, or even a tsunami, but the sound was multiplied by 100 times and was deafening. Everyone on the ledge of the wall was practically jolted by this roar until they could barely remain standing. Very clearly, Shilian heard the slight rustling sound of falling debris and stone that had been unlodged by the vibrations of the snarl. Only criminals were thrown into the sinner's pit. Could it be? Was the thing responding to Mo the souls of deceased sinners? At this moment, Mo once again yelled into the pit. Shilian listened carefully. This time, Mo hadn't roared something incomprehensible, and it hadn't been a curse either. On the contrary, it ought to have been encouragement. In fact, Shilian was very certain he heard the words, "fellow brothers." After Mo finished roaring, he yelled something at the soldiers detaining Shilian and the others. This time, Shilian completely understood what Mo had ordered. The general said, "Just drop 2 people down there." Hello, Bobby. Are you sad? Come on. Oh, there he is. Hello. Why were you crying? Why were you sad? Am I not paying attention to you? I'm sorry. I don't know if y'all can hear that, but he started crying. Well, that is chapter 24, part 1, I believe. I think there's 2 parts. We will read the next part, and that might be where we stop. That's actually, this is the last section that's translated by Circulations. So there are various, if you read Chinese online web novels, the folks that translate them are fans. And there's various groups, various individuals who do it. This particular book was divided between 2 groups because the first one was unable to finish the project and another one took over. Personally, I actually really preferred the second translation because I felt like translation is half knowing the language and half being a writer, and sometimes translations are translated but they are not written well. Like, they aren't made to sound good in the language they've been translated into, which I feel like this story kind of has some of those problems because there's certain sentences, certain phrases that just do not sound natural in English at all. I think the second group does a better job. I mean, either way, these people do this stuff for free and it's such hard work, so, like, props to you. But I'm excited to get to the second group's work. I'm gonna have to look up where they are. Chapter 24, Part 2. Although everyone else didn't understand what Keimo had said, they could probably roughly guess what the soldiers intended to do. As a result, their complexions turned white. When Shilian saw how they were all scared to the point they could barely remain standing, he moved a step forward and softly said, "Don't be nervous. If something happens, I'll face it first." If by chance someone had to be thrown in later, then Shilian would just brace himself and go down to take a look. In any case, only the stereotypical vipers, ferocious beasts, malicious spirits, or demons would be at the bottom of the pit. Since Shilian wouldn't die from the fall, or die from being bitten, or die from being poisoned, as long as there wasn't any lava or raging flames, or corpse-transforming poison water, he wouldn't become too unsightly, even if he did jump down. My poor child! He's like, oh, I'll be fine, even if they poison me, or kill me, or as long as they don't set me on fire, I'll be fine. You gotta stop doing this, my son. In addition, Shilian still had Ruoi. Even if the spiritual array hindered him from using Ruoi to climb back up, if these Banyu soldiers threw someone else down, he would be able to catch them. Keimo had said, bring the others away and keep an eye on them. That meant the other people would be relatively safe for the time being. After all, catching live people in the desert wasn't an easy thing to do. They couldn't just let them be eaten all at once, so the soldiers probably wanted to hoard them and let them be eaten, one at a time. Shilian thought these things through. However, who would have thought that there would be someone in their group who couldn't keep their cool? Other than Shilian and Sun Long, whose expressions hadn't changed, everyone else was trembling with fear ever since they'd climbed to the top of the Sinner's Pit, especially Azao. Perhaps it was because he thought death was certain and it would be better to try and desperately fight. Azao fisted his hands and suddenly revolted. With a bowed head, he charged at Keimo. See, this is an exact example of what I mean, though. Azao fisted his hands. No one would say that in English. You'd say Azao clenched his fists. Fisted his hands comes off so unnaturally. Anyway, that's just me being picky. It appeared that Azao had the determination to take down Keimo with him to death. In other words, he was charging at him in hopes of knocking Keimo down into the pit himself. And despite Keimo's tall stature that could be likened to an iron tower, even he retreated 3 steps in the face of a collision that encompassed one's last resolution before death. Since Keimo nearly lost his footing, he was immediately angered. After roaring once, he flipped over a hand and pushed Azao down. When they saw the youth fall down into the dark and deep pit, everyone screamed. Shilian also yelled, "Azao!" At this moment, a burst of cheers distantly resonated from the bottom of the dark pit, along with extremely cruel, tearing noises. Those sounds could be likened to the results of evil spirits falling over each other in their eagerness to be savagely fed. One knew just by hearing this that the youth named Azao didn't have a chance to return alive. Even Shilian didn't expect things to develop like this. He was stunned. Originally, he'd been suspecting Azao was precisely the Banyu Grand Tutor's subordinate, and that he was specifically enticing passerbys into the ancient Banyu kingdom. He'd also harbored suspicions that the one the half-buried face had mentioned when he claimed to have seen someone 50 years ago was Azao. However, Shilian hadn't anticipated the youth would be the first one among them to be killed. After jumping down like this, how could there be a possibility for Azao to survive? Phil. Well, it's a good thing he likes fisting, because the monsters just made him their puppet. They just tore him to bits. Was it possible he was feigning his death? However, Shilian and the others were already captives of the soldiers. If Azao had truly been the Banyu Grand Tutor's subordinate, he would be completely capable of tearing down his disguise now that he had the upper hand. Azao could have acted high and mighty, so why would he have done something as superfluous as feigning his death in front of them? There was no meaning in doing something like that. But why did Azao charge at Kamo? Wasn't this the same as throwing his life away? As Shilian pondered all these theories, one after another in confusion, the Banyu soldiers began once again looking for the next person to push down. Kamo raised a hand and pointed at Tiansheng. A Banyu soldier extended his large palm as he came forth to grab him. Tiansheng was immediately scared into yelling, "Save me! Don't grab me! Shilian had no time to continue thinking. He stepped forward and said, "General, wait a moment." When he heard Shilian open his mouth and speak Banyu Kingdom's language, a shocked expression appeared on Kamo's dark face. He waved his hand and stopped the soldier before he asked, "You know how to speak our language. Where are you from?" Shilian gently replied, "I come from the Central Plains." He didn't mind lying and saying he was from Banyu Kingdom, but the lie wouldn't be feasible. Shilian wasn't sure how fluent his language was or how much he'd picked back up, so he chose to so he would inevitably expose his secret while conversing with Kamo. In addition, his appearance made it obvious just where he hailed from. The people of Banyu Kingdom extremely disliked those who lied and deceived others. If they saw through the lie, the consequences would be severe. Kamo said, "The Central Plains? You're a Yong'an descendant." Shilian replied, "No, Yong'an Kingdom has long been wiped out. There are no longer any more Yong'an people." However, in the eyes of the people of the Banyu Kingdom, as long as someone was from the Central Plains, they were more or less the relative or descendant of the Yong'an people. Banyu Kingdom had been destroyed by Yong'an Kingdom's army. The moment he was told where Shilian came from, Kamo's dark face instantly turned furious. The crowd of soldiers began clamoring about. Their yells were completely composed of curses and belittling words. Shilian listened to them. They only said things like despicable, liar, throw him down. Superficial things that didn't hurt or tickle. He doesn't care. Oh, my boy, he's so brave. Kamo said, "Our kingdom is already faded away 200 years ago in the desert. You are not from our kingdom, but you know our language. Who the hell are you?" Shilian couldn't help but glance at the calm and composed young man standing beside him. He thought if worse came to worse, and he became unable to continue explaining, he would just have to brace himself and yell, "San Long, save me!" Shilian prepared himself to begin talking rubbish. However, at the very moment, another earth-shattering roar came from the bottom of the pitch-dark pit. It appeared whatever was down there had finished feeding on Azao. However, they were still hungry, and thus they used the sound to convey their craving for fresh flesh. Kamo waved his hand, looking as if he was about to grab Tiansheng again. Shilian said, "General, let me go first." Kamo definitely had never heard someone ask to go first in this place. His eyes widened and looked like bells as he asked in astonishment, "You want to go first? For what reason?" Shilian naturally couldn't reply and say it was because he wasn't scared. Thus he chose an answer that conformed with the norms of society. "General, these are merely innocent merchants passing through. They even have a child amongst them." When Kamo heard this, he sneered and said, "When your Yong'an army massacred my kingdom, did you never think about how many were also innocent merchants and children here?" It had already been 200 years since Banyu Kingdom was destroyed. Nowadays, both sides had long transitioned into a new dynasty. However, these soldiers were the dead whose time had long come to a halt. Their hatred would not weaken following the start of a new regime. Kamo spoke again. "You are very suspicious. I want to ask you questions, so you cannot go down. Throw someone else in." In that case, there was nothing to be done. Shilian was prepared to see things through to the end and make it his priority to jump first, when he saw Sun Long walk forward a step. Heart jumping, he turned his head. The young man had crossed his arms. With an indifferent gaze, he thoughtfully sized up the deep sinner's pit. A bad premonition sprung up, unbidden, in Shilian's heart. Sun Long? When he heard Shilian call him, Sun Long turned his head. He smiled faintly and said, "Everything's fine." Once again, the youth took another step forward. He was already standing at an extremely dangerous place. Both Shilian's heart and his eyelids were jumping about wildly. "Wait! Sun Long, stop moving!" At the very edge of the sinner's pit, the hem of the youth's red clothes flew about vigorously in the wind. Sun Long gave Shilian a glance before smiling once. He said, "Don't be afraid." Shilian said, "You retreat first and come back. If you come back, then I'll stop being scared." Sun Long replied, "There's no need to be worried. I'll leave for a bit. We'll be able to see each other again very soon." Shilian said, "Don't!" He had yet to finish talking when the youth once again took another step forward. While maintaining his posture with his crossed arms, he made a gentle leap and instantly disappeared into the unfathomable depths of the darkness. The split second Sun Long had jumped, Ruroy flew off Shilian's wrist. It turned into a streak of white in hopes of coiling around the young man's figure. However, the speed of Sun Long's fall was too quick, so much the white silk hadn't even been able to grab a corner of his clothes before it dimmed down and returned to Shilian. Shilian immediately knelt beside the tall walls and yelled into the sinner's pit, "Sun Long!" No response could be heard. After the youth jumped down, nothing could be heard. On the wall beside him, many Banyu soldiers began shouting, one after the other. All of them sounded extremely shocked. What was happening today? In the past, one had to capture someone and throw them down to actually make them fall. Today, everyone was taking turns and fighting over the chance to jump down. And if you didn't let them jump, they jumped down themselves. General Kamo shouted loudly at his soldiers and told them to calm down. And when Shilian saw how Ruroy hadn't been able to grab onto Sun Long, he didn't have enough time to think everything through. Instead, he merely recalled Ruroy before he threw himself into a leap toward the sinner's pit. But who would have thought that although his body was already flying through the air, the back of his collar would suddenly tighten. Shilian ended up suspended in midair. He turned to take a look. It turned out that when General Kamo saw how he had wanted to jump down, the general unexpectedly reached out and grabbed Shilian to prevent him from falling. Shilian thought to himself, "It's fine if you want to come. In fact, it's better if we go down together." The idea prompted him into action. Like a white snake, Ruroy suddenly curled around Kamo's arm and climbed up. With a swish, it wrapped itself around the general's entire body. Kamo saw how this thin white silk was strange and unfathomable, and even appeared to have cultivated its own consciousness. In response, the black veins on his forehead bulged, while the flesh of his muscles grew a few times bigger. It seemed as if he wanted to forcibly snap Ruroy, who was coiled around him. Shilian was stuck in this deadlock when Kamo suddenly saw something extremely strange out of the corner of his eye. The corpse that had been hanging from that long pole suddenly moved and raised its head. The crowd of Banyu soldiers noticed how the corpse had moved. One after another, they started to yell before they waved their teeth-embedded cudgels to strike the corpse. But after the black-clothed girl had moved, she somehow managed to untie the string that had been hanging her from the pole. She jumped off and rapidly rushed over. She could be likened to a black breeze that blew over the top of the tall wall. Rapid yet demonic, all the soldiers were instantly tormented by this nefarious wind until they were swaying from side to side. Accompanied by miserable shrieks, many soldiers fell down the tall wall. When he saw how his soldiers were swept down from the wall and into the pit, Kamo began furiously cursing. His curses were extremely vulgar, and probably used a decent amount of street slang. Shilian hadn't understood everything he'd said, but he did understand one sentence. Kamo had been cursing, "It's that slut again!" The next moment, Kamo was unable to continue cursing because Shilian had exerted strength to drag the general down into the sinner's pit with him. The sinner's pit, the one you can never climb out of after falling into it. As they fell, Kamo released a bellow that nearly shattered Shilian's eardrums. Shilian had no choice but to recall Roy before he casually gave Kamo a kick, so the distance between them would be a bit greater and his ears could be protected. Following that, he compelled Roy to glide up in the hopes it could grab something Shilian could use as a cushion. At least then he wouldn't land in a miserable fashion. However, the Sinner's Pit was built in a way that was difficult to deal with, and the spiritual array was very powerful. Not only was Roy unable to climb somewhere high, there was nothing it could grab onto inside the walls. Just when Shilian thought he was once again going to become a human pancake, the kind that wouldn't get scraped off the ground for a couple days, like how he had countless times in the past. Suddenly, amidst the darkness, a silvery light flashed past. The next moment, a pair of hands gently caught him. With incomparable precision, the person caught him head on. It was practically as if this person had been guarding the place, specifically waiting to catch him. One hand wound around Shilian's back, hugging his shoulders, while the person's other hand supported his knees. In a relaxed and easy manner, the person managed to completely disperse the fierce momentum that had been created during Shilian's fall. Shilian had fallen from a great height before coming to a sudden stop, so he felt a bit faint and a little dizzy. He subconsciously lifted his hand and tightly embraced the person's shoulders. Sunlong? Darkness surrounded them, so it was impossible to see anything. So of course there was no way for him to see who this person was. However, Shilian still blurted out these words. The other person did not reply. Shilian touched that person's shoulders and chest a few times. Wanting to verify their identity, he asked again, Sunlong, is that you? He didn't know whether it was because they'd arrived at the bottom of the pit, but the smell of blood in the air was strong enough to make people swoon. Shilian didn't know what possessed him either, because he actually began to casually feel up that person. It was only after he touched the person's hard Adam's apple that he suddenly snapped out of his daze. Shilian thought, I've sinned, what am I doing? He immediately retracted his hand before asking, It's Sunlong, right? Are you alright? Were you wounded? After quite a while, he finally heard the young man's reply. From a place extremely close to him, the youth's deep voice resonated over. I'm fine. Shilian didn't know why, but he felt that compared to Sunlong's usual tone, there was a subtle difference in his current voice. We're finally gonna get to see Demon Sunlong. Hua Cheng has arrived. Yeah. So, obviously, Mister's given up the ghost, so to speak, given up his disguise. Alright, my voice is a little hoarse, so that might be where we stop, especially because now I've got to go find the other translation group that continued the story from chapter 25 on. That's such a good stopping point, too, though, to just leave you right there with, Hua Cheng has arrived! If I remember right, the differences, they probably go into the differences next time, but, beforehand, he was a teen, sort of a 18-year-old, now he's an adult, so his voice drops. I guess that's why it focused on the Adam's apple, because now he's an adult, and they're like, I've sinned. I love that part where he's like, oh god, I've sinned. Anyway, this story's so cute. I'm really, really enjoying rereading it. Thank you all for joining me. We'll be back next Monday, with a longer read. Once I've got the second section back up. I didn't realize these two chapters wouldn't be that long. But since my voice is hoarse, we'll give it here. We'll be back with Silent Hill in a little bit, and then tomorrow we're gonna be hanging out, playing games, watching more Untamed. Watching more Untamed. The t-shirts are still for sale. Link is in the description, I think. If it's not, I'll put it there. Until the 4th. And I've got a new website for my store. You can click on the shop button in the description to go to the new store. I think it looks super cool. Yeah, so I think that's everything. If you like what I do, support the channel. Links in the description for all that. My voice is going. I'm gonna go drink some tea. Thank you all again, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.